Thank you very much, Stuart. Very thought-provoking. I was particularly interested in two or three of the things you said about the notion of perhaps USPs for cities and priority sectors are no longer as relevant as we once thought they were. Also fascinated about the idea of changing city boundaries, so perhaps Leeds and Bradford need to merge. And also your final thoughts about the relative position of London and the rest of the country. Okay, there's a chance now to interrogate some of what Stuart said. And first of all, I'd like to invite Chris Hagdin, who I know is somewhere, but I'm not quite sure where you are, Chris, just to give a first response to what Stuart said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed getting my head around Stuart's presentation. It was well outside my comfort zone, and I had initial panic thinking about whether I was qualified to comment on Kondratiev cycles, etc. But as I worked through the presentation, I thought I could recognise many of the changing nature of producer cities. So as I felt a bit more comfortable to comment on it. I certainly recognise how manufacturing continues, but with less and less people involved. Just a week ago, I went round the Vauxhall Vivaro plant where I work in Luton as head of planning, and 70% of the manufacturing functions are done by robots these days, and as production could increase, so they would just automate a little bit more. But it is important because it's about supply chains, and it's about about academics and training, and therefore the quality of local education is important. And again, that's a sort of cycle of what is important to that place. I had to ask Stuart this morning as to what a manifesto-led identity was, but having explained that to me, what I decided to do was sort of work through the 10 propositions, and I just assumed they were all correct. And what does it mean for sort of action or policy making? At least I assumed they were all correct until about the last couple, which I was beginning to struggle with as to how we'd make it happen or whatever. But anyway, so in terms of the 10 propositions, successful characteristics about resilience and diversification, people skills rather than outputs. One thought is it's actually more complicated than it might have been previously. Reconciling the competing with being attractive. That could possibly be a conflict, but actually quite a lot of the time, if you make a city beautiful, it will attract investment. So I don't think there's necessarily a conflict between those two. On number 3, outstanding business ecosystems. Again, it's very difficult to put your finger on what it is. You can't see it, is my overriding thought about that. It means it's difficult for policymakers. Number 4, the importance of history, geography, institutions, buildings, leadership of people. Again, this is largely about people, and by definition, they are mobile, so you need to make a reason to get them to stay. So that then links to proposition number 5, which is, well, one answer is to make the city beautiful. So it's about actually wanting to be there. So yes, the importance of long-term policy making rather than numbers and quantities of housing. And the Luton context that it's about quality, to try and change perceptions about what people feel about a place. Proposition number 6, tendency for rich and poor to divide. Yes, I think I probably accept that, and in the Luton context that is happening. People are moving to the periphery or outside the borough as soon as they can, and actually that creates problems because then they commute in to get the better jobs in the centre, so they've got infrastructure issues, and it leaves, for instance in the Luton context, it leaves more HMOs happening in Luton in the centre. We've got Revs and Bens migration from London, so there's an increasing density of poorer people, which is going to only get worse. Proposition number 7, quality of place leadership, public sector as prime movers. The local authorities are strapped for cash is a real problem we've got. Public health is coming into local authorities, and actually there's quite a bit of money coming with that. One of the prime wider determinants of health is whether you've got a job. So my suggestion is people grab public health money, make sure it's linked with the performance of the economy, because it's actually, you can justify it if you get your act together on that, I would suggest. Need for a real city, boundaries being reflecting economic realities. Well, Luton, it couldn't be a stronger case of that, because the boundaries are very, very tight. I'm trying to write a local plan now, and I can probably build half the housing I need. You know, when I had a wider regional strategy, that was giving me some sort of leverage on my neighbours. Now I've got to do the duty to cooperate. Well, that's an interesting tall order. So I thoroughly vote for that in terms of trying to make sure that a city has the control over the hinterland in order to resolve its issues. So when we get on to Proposition 9 and 10, then the issue of federal devolved cities, well, yes, that sounds really credible, but it actually raises issue about trusting local authorities. Number 10, this idea that we should do a massive devolution. Yes, that might be correct, but that sounded like a Big Brother solution to me, and I wasn't sure whether or not that was a slight contradiction in the thesis there. My overall thought of all this lot is it's really difficult to know what will deliver success, because it's about complexity, people, diversity, distinctiveness. And so in terms of what local authorities might do about this, well, they have to have a vision, they have to be based around quality of distinctiveness, they've got to be bold about what they do, they've got to lead on delivery, yes, at the local level, but central government actually needs to resolve its tussle about whether it actually wants to trust the public sector locally, because some of the stuff that we've got, national guidance, localism versus the direction, removing powers versus giving money to LEPs. I don't know whether LEPs is a vote of confidence in local areas, or in fact it's the opposite. So it's a really big challenge for, yes, local government, but also central government to decide whether or not it's going to play this game of this thesis. Thank you.
Chris, thank you for that. Just before we ask Stuart to respond to some of that, I know that Karen Escott from Sheffield Hallam also was just going to give a quick response. All right, there you are, Karen.
Okay, thanks very much. Really interesting analysis of the transitions that cities are undergoing. My comments are really in the light of research that I've done in different localities across English cities, and looking at the challenge really that I think has been raised several times this morning about job creation, fantastic ideas about producer cities, new jobs, but how do we link that up with the challenges of inequality and local labour market dilemmas, I suppose. So I'm just going to focus a bit on Proposition 6, which is about inequality, and raise some issues in terms of how we link economic growth with issues around incomes, race, gender, postcode lotteries. And they've been raised, I suppose, in some way, but I think we need to be more explicit about the priorities that we're talking about when we're talking about city improvements and the impacts on particular localities. So we've had a long history of economic regeneration in this country, 40 years of initiatives, but research that many people have undertaken shows that those areas where jobs have been created haven't been accessed by certain groups, and particularly groups of young people now, currently. Research I've undertaken with young women in Birmingham who were highly qualified, lived in particular localities very close to job growth. They didn't access or benefit from the jobs created. So what are the challenges there for us as policymakers, but also in terms of thinking about training and skills? People talk about training for training's sake, so that issue about the journey towards employment and experience is also really important in that. One of the other aspects coming out of research shows that locality is really important. There's been a lot of emphasis on the city centre. We have neighbourhoods which are also got major challenges not far from the city centre, and we know that those people who are least likely to access jobs are often those people who live very close to those jobs, but also see very great spatial constraints, not just in terms of physical access, but also access in terms of aspiration and horizons of what they might work towards. So In terms of linking up those questions, I think the important thing to think about is how we link up economic development with job creation, and understanding the sort of human and cultural capital of places with economic agendas, which are obviously very current, and thinking about the quality of employment, types of jobs, the types of sectors that people are likely to enter in terms of different social characteristics, what services there are to support people. And then finally, really, a question for Stuart around the fairness agenda. Many cities have worked towards developing a more, I suppose, explicit agenda around the living wage, job quality, and thinking about how the fairness agenda is going to be taken forward in this climate of austerity and economic development emphasis, which sometimes forgets the social side of things.
Thank you, Karen. Lots of ideas there from both. Stuart, a brief response, obviously after that, to some of what's just been said.
Is this on?
Yeah.
I can't possibly respond to all those. There's another lecture in that. Thanks for bearing with me. Nobody threw anything while I was speaking, so I assume that...
Yeah, it's fine.
It's not. Anyway, can you hear it? Okay. I just took a very big canvas, really, to try and stir you all up. I mean, I spent 30 years of my life before I retired being very controlled in what I said, because I always, if you could possibly say to members of the public and businesses and so on, they didn't want to hear this kind of stuff. You know, it's what can we do tomorrow, what can we do in the short term. But this is me kind of letting my hair down a wee bit and saying, no, I mean, if I was really going to do something about provincial cities, which I've worked in all my life, it needs an agenda like this. And that's my excuse for going to the edges of belief on some of these things. We do have to tackle those. I don't have answers to some of the ones that, the questions, I mean, genuinely on the whole business of inequality and so on, I feel much more comfortable with the idea of poverty. I don't feel comfortable with the idea, but, you know, in a sense I think it's probably tackleable than this notion of inequality, which connotes so much, you know, health, the agenda and the gender agenda and all sorts of other things. I feel more comfortable in an economist and an expert with an expertise in economic development having something to say about poverty. And the word I used out there was outrage. I think we could do with a bit more outrage on this issue, because it is really getting worse out there. So, and you all know that anyway, so I'm just encouraging you to show a bit more outrage on it. The one last thing, I will say the one last thing that I wanted to say, which was, no, I'll say two last things. One, I wanted to be brave about using the word beautiful. In the past, I've always said attractive. Create an attractive place. That's what we want, a nice attractive place. And now I find I've come out and I can now say beautiful. I don't feel restrained about it. Let's do a beautiful place. And I think more people should say, well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do a beautiful place here. Never mind the attractiveness. It's going to be beautiful, because it does have to be like that. And secondly, don't underestimate my rallying call about more dynamism all round. You know, I mean, it doesn't work like this, but if every business in this city improved its performance by 1%, you would have no problems. And so it's shifts at the margin that make a real difference. And of course, it's impossible to improve the performance of everybody by 1%.
Thank you. I think we've just got time for one, or if you're suitably brief, a couple of other contributions or questions from the floor. Does anybody want to chip in? Oh, but yes. On the front here.
Great presentation, and I agree with all but one of the assertions that you made, Stuart, about the future. I agree the idea that local authorities and the public sector should take leadership, should have energy, should have more devolved control over funding, should have different boundaries and so on. And I agree with the idea of needing an entrepreneur supporting ecosystem for businesses. Where I would want more guidance from you, I think, is around, let's not worry about sectors and forget about more specific support, because I think that starts to then challenge the whole question of distinctiveness of a place. And we are in the UNESCO City of Film, We're in a place that has got university and there's strong knowledge. We heard from John before about the importance of research. I think there are some fundamentally important sectors that we can and should be supporting to nourish cities that should not be abandoned. Otherwise, we will lose the ability to be distinctive.
I worked for the Scottish Development Agency, which I think probably invented technology sectors and then went on to invent clusters. So you can shoot me over coffee if you like, which caught on in England in the late 90s. We went through the kind of economic development faddism of healthcare, electronics, tourism in the 80s, and then we were into clusters, which was much more. Now, I was also party to a big piece of research that was done by SSRC on British cities, basically. And on the whole, it's very difficult to summarise 5 years researching this, but on this issue, we basically said there's no really good evidence that clusters work in practice in the way that the theory says. All the studies, most of the studies on the individual cities seem to be saying it's the fundamentals that seem to be key. Get the fundamentals right. You know, I mean, it's kind of like O-level text. You know, you say, well, you know, let's have a ready available supply of space that people can work in that's reasonably priced. Let's have an available supply of land that people can actually come and develop on. Let's have a really good, well-educated, trained resident population. All these kind of 5 or 6 key things. Connectivity. These are the ones that build economies. And in a sense, you're creating a milieu that anybody could thrive in. The thing I think about, yes, you're right, then there's bound to be a degree of what economists call agglomeration. Companies will come and seek each other out, and it will, but not on a major scale. And I think it's too much happenstance to put resource, extensive resource, into a sector in a city. I think it's probably appropriate to think of this in terms of national level, and I wish the government would have an industrial policy, to be honest. Sorry. Yeah, well, it's a good question, and it's one I've agonised a lot on, but I just try and draw a distinction between the importance at national and at subnational level, and I think there is a difference. I think there's been a lot of effort wasted by the RDAs. I mean, they had cluster champions going around. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what can we show. I mean, I can tell you what we can show for it in Scotland. Not a lot, to be honest. And there were millions of pounds invested in cluster development.
Stuart, for now, thank you. We're pretty tight for time. Thank you for that, Michael. The particular phrase that will be ringing in my ears for a long time beyond today was the old geography has been swept away, and that really interesting table with so few northern places on the table. We are a bit tight for time, but I am going to invite 2 responses, and can I ask both of our contributors to be really brief and try and keep your contribution to just a minute or so that we do have time maybe for 1 or 2 other questions. So first of all, Claudia Murray from Henley Business School. Claudia, you are just down here. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. I agree with both presentations, so they were very interesting. I think there was something that it wasn't mentioned, which was the studies after, Stuart, you mentioned Freeman, and after that in the 1990s you have all the studies by Saskia Sassen, who is coming to London to speak about migration. She talks about advanced producer services, and she talks about different sectors, the finance sector, and then all the service in terms of law firms, accountancy firms, advertising firms, and IT and technology. We heard about IT and technology today. I wonder whether there have been any studies on law firms, accountancy firms, and we heard a little bit of media and advertising. But I'm completely ignorant about Bradford, and you can hear from my accent, I'm not from the UK, so I'm learning quite a lot. But my area of research is mainly Latin America, and I'm applying these 2 cities in Latin America. And what we are doing, we do the same as here. We have all these numbers and unemployment rate, but what I think is missing as well here is going out and surveying employers and finding out what their needs are in terms of location. If the office space that is provided is suitable for them. The linkage between the employers and universities is also very important. In São Paulo, for example, we found that there was a gap between universities, particularly young graduates coming from IT and technology, and linking that to the service and IT and communication companies. So there's a lot to be said to have data and numbers out there, but you also need to go out and do surveys with employers and find out, particularly with decision makers, the ones that they take the location and strategies for the firms. Because I think something that urban planners and architects and urban designers, we got to understand is that these multinational organizations, they don't function at city level, they function at global level, and they need connectivity. And another point about, we talked about today on competition, city competition, and the fact that these multinational organizations work at different levels in different cities. There's also cooperation going on. Everybody thought that when the European Central Bank moved to, was based in Frankfurt, it was going to be the end of London, but it wasn't. And there's a very good paper by Colin Lesieri, and talks about how the 2 cities are in fact cooperating. So yes, there is competition, but there's also collaboration between cities. And we talked about inequality, and there's an interesting, which is something I wanted to put forward the question. There's an interesting new book coming from the US, from some academics. They are talking, the book is called something, Enough is Enough. And the idea is just to put a cap on growth, because this economy, which is always seeking growth, is damaging the environment. So they are coming with this idea that maybe we should just decide that we reach a level where we cannot seek growth all the time, and we need to put a cap on that and spread the wealth that we have. So,
thank you for that contribution. Sorry to cut you off. I'm also just briefly going to ask Anne Wallace from Culture Partners. Anne, whereabouts are you? Right at the back. Just to make a brief contribution as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a couple of quick points. I know we're a bit short on time, but I think we have to. I just want to take a little slice through what you were talking about there, Michael, and think about the contribution of the arts and cultural sectors and the creative industries. We know that many places have been culturally led, looking at sort of Newcastle and Gateshead, for example, in the recent decade. But what I'm also very interested in is those long-term cultural organisations who are embedded in local places, and really what they do, both for the sort of local community development, picking up on some of your earlier talks about your mural and what that instigated in terms of people's relevance to their place, I think, and their, the way they think about where they live and what they do. But also those cultural organisations that actually are able to open up much wider horizons, thinking about the need for the innovation. We were talking about, we walked around Bradford yesterday and people were talking about the creativity and the innovation and the entrepreneurial spirit in a particular area where lots of small creative industries were starting to develop, and those hubs of vitality were changing those parts of the city. I think my second point really is more that the sort of the senior leadership, if you like, the local government and national government. There seems a real confluence at the moment. We've had some very recent speeches and reports the Secretary for Culture, very recently said, only last month, that culture and creativity really should be at the heart of driving the economic growth, development, thinking about innovation and how creativity underpins a lot of the industrial growth. And just to finish on, just a couple of weeks ago, the Arts Council also looked at the economic and social contribution of the arts and culture. And a couple of stats I'd just like to leave you with to think about, and maybe some thoughts, Michael, on these. They talked about the spillover effect of the arts and cultural industries in 2011, particularly around tourism. And of course, this is culture tourism and heritage tourism as well. And they said that 1 in 3 of all international tourists to the UK come because of the arts and cultural offer that there is. And that actually amounts to 42% of all tourist spend. And I'm wondering how some of the national policies can actually try and close the gap around the local development needs and the way in which the local cultural organisations, some of those we know are quite significant. We think about recent buildings, iconic landmarks like the Hepworth in Wakefield and the Turner in Margate, actually driven by local interest, influence, supported by their regions, but actually now have national and international profile.
Thank you very much. Michael, a really brief, if you would, response to some of what was just been said.
Two very thoughtful contributions, and a lot to agree with in both, and not much to disagree with. It's perhaps worth saying that in these debates we often use a shorthand of the finance sector to talk about statistically the finance and business services sector, which brings together, this is in response to something Claudia said, which brings together those law firms, those accountancy firms, the cluster, and of course the City of London is the most successful and long-running cluster you could imagine, but very difficult to transfer to any other location. Now, the thing about employment in those companies is that, in a sense, the global is the local. It is one of 2 or 3 world locations, and the companies have bid up starting salaries in competition with each other to very high levels indeed. And it's difficult to see how to read off from that to lessons for economic development elsewhere in the UK. A very thoughtful contribution from Anna about, the other point Claudia made about growth. I do think we have to debate that. We have to, it seems to me, policymakers, national and local, are putting everything on a vision of growth. And actually, I tried to raise the point rather briefly in my section on resilience. It's not clear to me that growth is a realistic option for all of the older communities. Now, that is not an easy or palatable conclusion to draw, and it seems to me we need to look at the way the word growth is used in both the national economic debate and in the green debate, because again, it's not always used in the same way, but growth in the sense of everywhere, the Alice in Wonderland caucus race, everyone shall have prizes. I don't think it's self-evidently true, and we need to think through what that means. I don't have a clear answer to that. Very quickly on Anna's point about culture, and I'd link this to education as well. I think we, and I was involved in it 20 or 30 years ago, became involved in arguing that cultural activity and creative industries were a very important contributor to national prosperity and a distinctive offer and something that our cities could do very well. And I think all that was good, and we reached the point that the creative industries were bigger than the motor industry, and that's important. But I think we have to be clear that the justification for them is not. The justification for that, for working those, is a commitment to truth and beauty and knowledge and learning. It's not saying we do this because we've done the maths and it's more cost effective than building cars. It seems to me that is the death of art, and we need to make sure that we stick with those basic aesthetic values while recognising that this is quite an important way for people to earn their living.
Thank you very much on that really upbeat note. Big thank you to Michael and to Stuart and to all of you for your contributions. I hope you found this session interesting and illuminating. Thank you very much. Thank you.